have seated here to my left, first Kevin Nichols. He's the owner of K&C Solar and has been fascinated with generating power from the sun since he was a kid. He's been involved with solar equipment and solar projects for over 10 years, including supplying off-grid DIY projects to remote area cabins. He's looking to make the world a cleaner and greener place through solar power and will be speaking about his experience in the business. Next to him we have Kurt Hull. He helps groups working on climate change, sustainability, and resiliency solutions. He's helping Winnipeg move to a fossil-free future by working with groups like the province of Manitoba, the city of Winnipeg, Bike Winnipeg, 50 by 30, Transition Winnipeg, Sustainable Building Manitoba, and the Winnipeg Transit Riders Association. He is working with Akai Energy and Northlands First Nation to develop an integrated community sustainable development plan for Lac Brochet. He also worked at with Sports Manitoba to develop the mountain bike racing venue at Fort White for the 2017 Canada Summer Games. And then to his left is Ross Redman. He is with the Manitoba Electric Vehicle Association. He's been a member of that association in 7 of the 7.5 years that it's been in existence. He has owned an electric vehicle for 6 years, and which was one of the first, or if not the first, electric vehicle in Canada. So it's all really interesting topics that they're going to be talking to us today. So I'd say take it away.
Go ahead. They introduced you first.
They introduced me first. Okay. What was the our question is, or are we just telling?
Well, maybe tell us a little bit about yourselves first, like in your
Okay.
your businesses,
Sure.
like
Yeah, well, like you mentioned, I've been fascinated with solar since I was a kid. I was always fascinated with how a little flat black plate with 2 wires coming in it could generate electricity. My fascination never stopped. I just wanted to, really develop that. Cost prohibitive when I was a kid. Their small solar panels were extremely expensive. A lot of the stuff has come down in price now, though, and it's more a mainstream projects now that occur a lot throughout the world. But I just wanted to make sure or help people. I guess get cleaner and greener and have their own power, that they don't rely on somebody else, such as hydro or whatnot. I do have a lot of projects on the go still that I probably should have finished up for the winter, but my experiences are that anybody who's got solar loves it.
Okay. This is like my second career working on climate change. I spent about 25 years in manufacturing, electronic design and manufacturing, and actually worked with Ross for at least a decade. Okay? But in 2006 I saw an inconvenient truth, and it profoundly affected me. Having a family and kids, I was always concerned about my kids, but this really channeled or focused my concern with climate change. And because of some restructuring that happened at the company Ross and I were both working at the time, I was given an opportunity to change careers, and I took it and took work with the Manitoba Eco Network. So I've been working on climate change full-time as my occupation for 10 years. And the work that I'm doing is really in 2 streams. There's Climate Change Connection is the name of our organization. It's a program of the Manitoba Eco Network. And we work on education. We work to educate Manitobans about climate change. And most of my time is spent on solution, working with the organizations that were listed there and trying to work towards a viable solution to climate change in Manitoba. And what that means here in Manitoba is that I don't focus completely on greenhouse gas emission reduction, although that's extremely important, but I look at greenhouse gas emission reduction in the context of building resilience. And when I say resilience, what it means is building achieving our ability to satisfy or meet our own essential needs, and that means our needs for food, shelter, and transportation without fossil fuels. Meaning that, and if you think about it, we have to be inventive about our ability to feed ourselves without diesel fuel or synthetic fertilizers for the tractors and combines or for the fields. We have to be able to move all of the goods and people in the province without diesel or gasoline. And all of our buildings, old and new, have to be heated and cooled without natural gas. That's the challenge in front of us. And we have to be very, it's an urgent problem, and it's going to take a lot of ingenuity and energy. But that's what I'm focused on, those things.
My name's Ross Redman. I saw my first EV when I was a young teenager, before I was old enough to drive. It was quick and quiet, and I thought those were admirable qualities in a vehicle, so I tried to buy one when I turned old enough to drive. Unfortunately, I couldn't, because they're no longer produced, at least the one I saw, and anybody that had one didn't want to sell one. Over the years, I put deposits on 17 different vehicles. The one I own right now, I put a deposit on it in 2008, and I got it in 2011. It's been through 6 winters. This is its 7th winter. EVs work fabulous in the wintertime, far better than gasoline or diesel vehicles. The engine doesn't need to warm up because there is no engine. The transmission doesn't need to warm up because there is no transmission. The heat comes on right away like a space heater in your house. That's the feature my wife likes the best about the car. You have instant on heat, warm air blowing right away. But electric vehicles aren't just about cars. Although we talk about cars a lot, the fastest and the safest car in the world, or vehicle, as far as trucks or cars are concerned, is Tesla Model S. It actually broke the test equipment in the United States, and they decided they had to rewrite their rules because this car was far better than any of the safety testing that they could do at the time. It'll do 100 kilometers an hour in 2.24 seconds, and it's a nice family sedan. It's not a racing car, it's not a sports car, it's a family sedan. There are also pickup trucks. One of the companies that buys electronics from the company I work for is Workhorse, and they make a pickup truck. There are other companies that do as well. There's SUVs. The most famous is the Tesla Model X. It's got the flapping wing doors, which gets everybody's attention. But it's also the safest SUV or truck of any kind that you can buy. RAV4 was made by Toyota for a while, and now they stopped for a while, and they're rumored to be starting again. I own a boat. It's a nice little boat, 20-foot pontoon boat. It holds 11 people. It'll haul 2,705 pounds of people and stuff, and it runs on electricity. This summer it spent out at the cabin, and it ran off solar. So I was driving on sunshine all summer at the lake. You can buy off-the-shelf factory outboards, 30 from a company called Torquedo. It's called a 30 horsepower Deep Blue. They also make 50s, 100s, 130s, 180s, 250s, and 300s. 300s made, and the 250 and the 180 are made by a company called Regen Nautic. There are lots of other companies that make those. I thought the 300 was kind of special because it's so powerful. It'll push along your nice little, I forget what they call them, runabouts, in excess of 60 miles an hour, if speed is your thing. I'm much more about quiet cruising. which is why I have a pontoon boat. Anyway, tractors, Case is currently got beta tractors in the field in the United States, and they're doing testing with farmers, select small group of farmers. They expect to have those tractors in production by 2020. Boeing is a company that makes jet planes. They have a small commuter plane. It's a hybrid plane, and it cuts its fuel usage by half. Not excellent in my humble opinion, but you know, half is better than nothing. They also make a large passenger jumbo jet, 777, with a hybrid system on it. And it pushes the jet on the taxiways, and it gives the jet assist when it's taking off. That alone will reduce the jet fuel consumption by half. When it lands, it refills the batteries on the plane, and then it also plugs in to top them up the rest of the way, because nothing is 100% efficient. There's ocean-going ships, a company in Korea, and I didn't have time to look it up before I came here. They have a hybrid solar, wind, and diesel ocean-going ship. Hauls containers. It's enormous. There's delivery trucks, big brown box trucks, yellow box trucks, and white box trucks you see running around the city delivering parcels. They make electric and hybrid versions, plug-in hybrid versions of those. Semi-trailer tractor trucks are made by Tesla, Mack Trucks, Nikola is another startup company, Cummins, and Mercedes-Benz. All of those companies have prototypes that are running on the highways today to prove that the technology actually works. There are other examples, but the point is all of our transportation needs could be met by electricity if we chose.
Thank you. So Dave gave me a few questions to ask. Would it be okay with you guys if I went ahead and asked his questions, and then if you have more questions? Paul? Okay. So for Kevin, as an installer of solar panels, where do you see solar power in 10 years?
Wow, 10 years, there's going to be a lot of rural areas with solar, without a doubt. City, I'm hoping it catches on in the city a little more, but rural areas for sure. A lot of farmers, I guess, are heavy users with the barns and whatnot, and they are putting up mega projects all the time. 30, 40, 50, 60 kilowatt projects. As a matter of fact, I recently had a gentleman email me for a quote on a 33 kilowatt project in Manitoba. Some of the stuff down south, and I wish I could have put the guys off, because they wanted solar in Mexico, but they wanted it in the summer. I was kind of asking if you could, get it done in the winter so I could have a nice winter vacation, but they kind of needed it right away, so I didn't bother bidding on that project. But in the being green as well, I subscribe to the principle, the MUSH principle, where it's municipal, universities, schools, and hospitals. They should all have, they all have rooftops, they all have adequate room for solar. They should all be powering with solar. I know there's a hospital in, I believe it's either Germany or Poland, I can't remember which, that my neighbors had visited, and the hospital actually generates more power than it actually uses, so they sell back. So solar in Manitoba, it's catching on. It's catching on slow, but the rural areas are really expanding, I would say exponentially. They're really jumping on the solar bandwagon, so to speak.
Okay, and I have a question for Kurt. From your perspective at the Climate Change Connection, what do you think the change in power production and use will be in 10 years?
Well, in terms of use, there will be a lot more electrification of vehicles. I mean, the transportation system will become, in a very few years, we'll reach a tipping point where there won't be any more, it won't make sense to buy gasoline vehicles. And that won't be too many years away. They've been talking, there's a study in Stanford that talks about the tipping point for vehicles, where when you reach a point where the vehicle is less than $30,000 to purchase, and you have a range of more than 300 kilometers, or some kinds of numbers like that in the same vehicle, there's no reason to buy a gasoline vehicle, and no one, then the range anxiety disappears. So long as we've got a charging system that accompanies it. I have a whole shopping list when it comes to the replacement for natural gas for building heat, and it's not just as simple as changing from natural gas to electric. The power demand is too high. With the current building stock that we have, if we were to, like in terms of the energy required for the heating, it's something like 18,000 gigawatts, 18 terawatts of power for the heat. But that's energy for the year. But because all of the energy for buildings is required in the wintertime all at once, it would require us to increase the energy generation in the province by more than what we have already. We would have to more than double the amount of generation that we've got if we just go from natural gas to electric. But in terms of generation, I frankly can't see a need for solar PV in this province for quite some time. The economics don't make sense. Because hydro has got generating capacity well into the future, an excess of generating capacity. One of the things that I did a few years ago was hydro has this thing that a needs for and alternatives to process that they have to go through, where in order to get licensed to build a dam, they have to show that there's a need for it and there's no alternative to it. And so they showed us a lot of data about the anticipated demand that they have to build to, and including domestic demand and demand from exports and anticipated exports. And the case, they were trying to build a case for Kiosk and Kanawapa. And the projections they had for demand are actually much higher than what the actual demand has been. And yet they got the license to build Kiosk, and when Kiosk comes online in 2019, it'll add something like 4,000 gigawatts of generating capacity for the province. And yet currently our demand is in the neighborhood of 22,000 gigawatt hours domestic, and the generating energy supply that we've got is 30,000 gigawatt hours, like well more than what we need. And yet we're going to add another 4,000 gigawatts with Kiosk. Hydro's got way more than they can even sell, and the demand that they anticipated internationally isn't materializing. So I don't see a reason, and I mean, I've got a spreadsheet, I can open it up, and the numbers are so tight in terms of your installed costs and the amount of energy that you can actually generate from it. Other than if you're in a remote area, it can make sense, but if you're connected to the hydro grid, I can't see a reason for new generation from solar PV in the near future, maybe 10 years from now. But again, as long as you've got hydro, which we're paying for anyways, I mean, I don't see a big demand, big reason, an economic reason for it, or even an environmental reason for it. If you're in Saskatchewan and Alberta, absolutely. There's a lot of coal that's still burnt there, and natural gas for their electricity. But in Manitoba, it's a different story. 98% of our power comes from hydro. So that's my take on it. I have to be convinced otherwise.
I have a question here for Ross. Electric cars are making their way on our roads. What is happening with other vehicles like boats, trucks, and farm equipment? Now, you kind of already
Yeah,
discussed-
I did cover
discussed
that
that.
a bit.
Yeah.
One that I forgot is buses, both transit buses and highway buses. Electric versions of those are currently available. Winnipeg has 4, I believe, that are being test driven on the 20 route in the city all the time. They work really well. All that hydro power that Kirk had talked about, Kirk had emphasized that we have 98% hydro. There's a little bit of wind power in the province, and there's, I think, 1 thermal station, maybe Brandon or someplace.
For emergency purposes.
For emergency purposes. They run it once every 6 months, I believe. It's almost never used.
Yeah.
So we have really, really clean power. The published number is 0.002 tons per megawatt hour. My car uses a megawatt hour in a year. Cost me $80. It's almost free driving my car. And as far as guilt-free driving, that 0.002 is less than the CO2 that comes out of 1 liter of gasoline. In addition to that, there are no other byproducts. There's no nitrogen oxides, there's no particulate matter, smog. There's no other downsides. So driving EVs is an excellent way to eliminate your environmental impact. EVs are quiet. You have to drive them as though everybody on the planet is deaf, because nobody will hear you coming. An example of that is this summer I was driving my boat along. There was a loon in front of me. I got like literally from here to the couch away from it, and it slowly swam off to the side. It didn't dive, it didn't fly, it wasn't scared of my boat at all. I drove into a bay with a whole bunch of turtles, and none of them jumped off the logs or the rocks that they were sitting on. My boat is extremely quiet. My car is extremely quiet. The semi-trailer trucks, the transit buses. I strongly recommend that you ride on the 20 bus at least once in the next month. It is amazing how quiet that is compared to any other transit bus you've ridden. That was one of the first things that attracted me to EVs. Now that I'm older and wiser, I recognize that the environmental impact is probably far more important than the noise. I think everybody in the province should drive electric vehicles. All kinds, shapes, and sizes for every application. There's a bunch of people that claim that hydro would be brought to its knees if we were all driving EVs. Numerical analysis of that proves that it's erroneous. Concern, the time when all of us are charging our EVs is actually at night. I plug up mine in when I get home at the end of the day, and it charges overnight and it's full in the morning. That's when hydro has the maximum amount of excess generating capacity. And so it meshes extremely well with what hydro has available. By utilizing that electricity at night, you actually improve the efficiency of the entire hydro system. The utilization goes up and the efficiency goes way up, and you make the whole system a better system.
And even to put, like, I had mentioned, I'm just sort of following on what Ross has said there, and put some numbers to it, because like I said, we can't just switch from natural gas to electric to heat our buildings. But when it comes to transportation, it's a whole nother story. Even if you just take the energy in the gasoline and diesel that was used in 2014, it equates to about 5,400 gigawatt hours of energy. That's very conservative, and that's the average generation anticipated from Kiosk. So that one dam, which is not online yet, could very generously supply all of the transportation needs for the province, and that's not taking into account things like the vehicles themselves are batteries for the system, and can supply the system, as Ross is saying, like in the off times, and there's all kinds of follow-on benefits to it. So and by the way, the generating capacity for Kiosk, part of the argument that they made in these NFAT hearings for the need for Kiosk, said that there's going to be an Energy East pipeline that needs to be powered. And so the rationale for Kiosk was to provide energy to push poop through a pipe, was basically, and they anticipated 1,700 gigawatt hours of energy required for the Energy East pipeline. Well, that's about a third of the energy that would be required for our entire transportation system. So it's much more beneficial to move around with a quiet, clean, not scaring the ducks kind of vehicle, as opposed to pushing poop through a pipe.
Does anyone else, do you guys have any questions? I have a question, or do you have questions? You go.
Yeah, my question has to do with the manufacture of electric vehicles, and what kind of an environmental footprint does that leave? And here I'm thinking in terms of some of the precious rare earth metals that are needed for electronics, and I'm thinking about lithium for the batteries, or whatever is coming down the pike in terms of battery technology. How polluting is it? How sustainable is it?
Well, there's the macro view of this. The gasoline or diesel version of my car required 5 tons of CO2 in order to manufacture the vehicle. The electric version that I drive required 8 tons. Those 3 extra tons I made up for in the first 14,000 kilometers. I made up for the entire cost of the car in the first 33,000 kilometers. There are precious metals in there, rare earth, particularly in motors, some in batteries. More and more they're moving away from those metals because they are expensive and they want to lower the prices. So they're using carbon and silicon and other metals and semiconductors which are readily available. It's not ideal yet by any stretch of the imagination. It's still a whole lot better than a gasoline car.
I'd heard that lithium is infinitely recyclable.
Yes.
And we don't do it yet because there's not enough market for the recycling.
Recycling of lithium batteries is already happening today. If you take the little coin cell out of your...
But car batteries,
car batteries are. There's not a big market for it yet. Most of the recycling of car batteries right now is actually reuse of the batteries. They're used in stationary applications where they're not so concerned with the absolute capacity of any given cell. They're worried about just the entire large pack. That helps with solar installations and wind installations, because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. So you need to have a battery backup system that will be able to keep the lights on at night while you have a calm, dark night.
Anyone else have a question? I have a question. Or you have to go ahead.
I just had a question for Kevin on, we were talking about the rural projects for your solar installation. What was some examples of that? I'm just trying to.
Examples,
Yeah, what were they?
there was a couple guys out in Brandon, I think they put up 78 kilowatts. They're extremely large ground mount projects, and they run their whole farm off of it. Some of the stuff too is when you start talking rural, as much as is stated that hydro is abundant, when you get into rural areas, it's not always reliable. So a lot of people, they make their livelihood and they need the electricity. So they go to solar because in the event of wires down, power outages, transformers going, they will always have electricity. In the daytime anyway, for sure. But they need that power to keep their farm going. So, but there is some substantial power that they put in. Nobody in the city would ever consider making that. The amount of room you need for that kind of stuff is huge. You're talking 200 to 300 feet long in some cases. So yeah, they're pretty big projects. But with some of the rural areas too, a couple of the gentlemen that I dealt with, they just had some land that it didn't grow anything. It was totally useless, unproductive land, and they couldn't grow stuff to save their life in that section of land. So they decided to put solar and just feed it back to the grid and use the power during the day for their farms.
So if you had a solar installation, could you be completely self-contained? Like you wouldn't have.
Well, in some cases where you're off the grid, yeah, you could be, yeah, and that's where the batteries and whatnot come in. I've done a lot of remote cabins where the guys have put up not huge projects, but enough to power and charge their batteries for the day, and they'll run all kinds of things at night. After supper, most of the time it's just lights, radio, TV, that kind of thing. But the batteries, I always look, when I explain to people, when you're doing an off-grid system, you got to look at your batteries like your fridge and your solar panels like your groceries. And all your appliances are your kids going in and getting the groceries. So you have to kind of match everything up. A lot of people figure that if I have a couple of 12-volt batteries and I have 6 panels, I'm going to be able to run my fridge, my stove, all my lights, everything. It doesn't always work that way. You have to match up your batteries with what you're actually going to use. I've done systems where all the guy wanted was a night light to read by at the end of the day, and that's it. Super small system. Another guy, he wants to, like you said, when you talk about heating, motors, compressors, that type of thing, they draw huge amounts of power. So you need a lot of battery power for that. And some of the guys have some pretty substantial battery banks, and not necessarily a huge amount of solar panels because they don't really need it. They just need to charge and fill the batteries to capacity rather than have access to overfill them. Mm-hmm. But it's, like I say, it's a matter of matching up, but they're totally off the grid. There's quite a few cabins that I've done, and some, I don't know how you call them, survivalists, so to speak, where they're ready for doomsday. And they've got, I'm serious, they've got all their stuff packed away, and if something goes south, then they're ready. They've got all the power they need, and they're ready for a long time, yeah.
So I have some cousins who live out in the country, and they just have like a house They don't have any livestock or anything like that, so their needs are fairly minimal. And I remember when they first bought the property, it was just a field, and they talked about like they had to bring hydro in, and it was really expensive
Yes.
for them to do that.
Yep.
And that was probably about 10, 15 years ago. And right now, this past summer, they have replaced it all with solar.
Mhm.
But something that I found really interesting that I'm wondering if you could help me understand why this might be the case. But they said that when they did the solar, hydro had to, or maybe they still are connected to the grid because they had the power lines put in. But anyway, when they went to solar, hydro allowed them to only put in as much solar as that was equivalent to their annual usage. So they couldn't sell anything back to hydro, basically.
Okay, maybe, I don't know, maybe at the time they did it, that was the rule. Now you can,
Because this is very recently.
yeah, you can, well, what they call is net zero. Hydro will only pay you for as much as, like, you can make more electricity than you use, but hydro's only gonna pay you for that certain chunk that you use. So, a lot of times when I'm doing estimates for guys that are doing grid tie, which is what that is, grid tie, they'll get the estimate from hydro based on their bill, and they'll say, you're using, well, the example I can use right now is what I'm working on. You're using 33,000 watts or 33 kilowatts a year, and we're only going to pay you for that size of system. So you can only put a 33 kilowatt system in place. Now, what they do stipulate is you can put bigger, but we're only going to give you $1 a watt, so you're only going to get the 33,000.
Okay.
Now, whether they pay you that extra or not, that one I'm not sure of, if you're generating more. They tell you can put more, but they're not gonna pay you for it.
Oh, okay.
So, but I know, when you talk about rural areas too, I have another gentleman, he moved a house, and I guess it was 3 kilometers from the nearest hydro line. So what he said was hydro wanted just an astronomical amount to run a hydro line to his house. It was actually cheaper for him to go off the grid and solar power than it was for hydro to run a line there. It was insane. So, you know, there's a case where, you know, the solar comes in handy. You know, like Kurt said, it's in the city, especially a lot of the new areas, it is more reliable electricity and whatnot. But I know, case in point, in my neighborhood in Charleswood, I was the only one making smoothies one morning because I had electricity and nobody else did. So, I mean, depending on how reliable an area you're in, you may want to look at it, you may not. Is it the end all and be all? No, probably not. Are you going to generate all the power that you need? If you want to, you can, yes. A lot of people I've dealt with, though, too, is their biggest issue was, I don't want to be a slave to hydro, because I can't dictate how much hydro is going to charge me. Whereas once I put my solar up, I don't pay anything. It's my power. And all I have to do is make sure that the sun is shining, in which you can't make sure, but once the sun's shining, you're making power. And if you want extra power, then you have a battery backup as well. But I know a lot of guys that I've given quotes to, the first thing out of everybody's mouth is, what's the payback? A lot of the paybacks on every system, whether it's big or small, is about 15 years. Now, every time hydro has a 3% increase, that drops by 2 years. So when you start looking at the increases that hydro wants in the next 4 years, now you're starting to look at about 8-year drops. So now you go from 15 years to 7 years. It's not bad.
I don't know, I saw you shaking your head there.
Well, does that include the $1 a watt subsidy?
That does include the $1 a watt subsidy. Yeah, when all the smoke clears, you got 15 years for you got to pay it back.
And what's the degradation on the panel?
They're 25 years guaranteed. So they'll produce the same amount of power for the 25 years. After that, they start degrading slightly.
I thought they degrade a certain percentage every year. It's not a cliff. your
A
performances.
lot of them now are. Yeah, actually, a lot of them now are. Well, I shouldn't say a lot of them. All the higher end panels are. They're guaranteed, and then they just start dropping off.
So then at about 25 years, you'd look at replacing.
It's just like shingles. Yeah, at 25 years, you're buying new ones. Yeah. But the thing with that is, though, is the only thing you're replacing, though, is the actual panel.
Right.
Everything else is in place.
Yeah.
You know, all your wiring is in place, your racking, the whole works. So you're just replacing the panels, which when you start looking at a 78 kilowatt system, 120, 200 panels, it's going to be pricey. But my guess would be if they keep going down the way they are, they're going to be relatively cheap in 25 years anyway.
Yeah, I saw the item that you're referring to about with Stanford and the projections, like for 2030 with the energy and electric cars and stuff like that. I saw that same, or a
Yeah, it was
video
even
that was-
earlier than that. Like
Yeah.
it was the tipping point was within 8 years there'll be no gasoline vehicles sold.
Yeah,
That was-
and part of that was predicated on because I think they were talking about solar-powered electric cars that drive themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and part of it was predicated on the cost of solar power coming down
Yeah.
a lot.
I mean, even the most conservative people from hydro say that even in Manitoba, the latest that will have grid parity is 2028. Grid parity meaning that the cost for electrical panel installation versus from the grid cost for grid power
Uh-huh.
will be equal in 2028, virtually anywhere in North America, and that's a very conservative estimate.
So as you were talking, you answered a couple of my questions, one of which was, do you think we have enough electric capacity here for everybody to convert to electric cars? And you kind of said, yes, we do. So then I was thinking of along the lines of, I know that like with the mega hydroelectric projects, that sort of what I don't know if it's locked into or whatever, but we've made this commitment that we're basically going to export a lot of that power, and that we're actually selling it out as a loss. But when I'm listening to what you're describing, I'm going like, wow, like what? Like I was thinking, I keep on meaning to buy shares on all the dope that's being released, like Delta 9 and stuff like that. But I thought, oh, I should put my money into electric, because I thought if we have this massive amount of power, and we have enough to do change it all over to electric, like there's a huge opportunity. Like we're set up.
Where do you see the opportunity? In the sale of power, or in satisfying the commodities, or what?
Go like just like the sales, the guys who are selling the cars.
But the people that are selling the cars don't want anybody to drive EVs. That's one of the hardest concepts for the average citizen to understand. And the reason for that is the biggest money maker in whoever, General Motors, let's take for example, is Mr. Goodwrench.
Yep.
Parts and service is a huge business. Now, you take away the engine, you take away the transmission, and you replace it with a simple DC electric or AC electric motor about that size.
Yep.
Everything else just disappears. There's no fuel systems, there's no cooling systems, there's no...
We got to convince the dealerships that where their future money is in electric vehicle conversion.
What are you saying?
Because in 8 years, if nobody's buying gasoline vehicles, and you happen to own a gasoline vehicle, you're really going to want to convert it.
Yeah.
And there's folks in MIVA that have been doing it, right? That have been converted. You converted a boat.
I converted the outboard in my boat.
Yeah, and I know there was a guy that did an S10 pickup.
Mhm.
a number of
The
years ago.
S15
Yeah,
actually,
10
but
10
close.
years ago or more. So there's, it's doable,
Absolutely.
and it's getting better and probably easier to probably be just like a lot of
The-
aftermarket bolt-on stuff in your, for,
The prices of electric motors are coming down, the prices of batteries are coming down, the prices of electronics are coming down. So it's really fairly easy to do.
and there'll be a
You-
huge amount of work.
You need a
required.
battery, you need a controller,
So,
and you need a motor.
I think
And
there's
that's all you
enough
need.
for them to take a lot of the dealerships into retirement with the money that they would get from that instead of doing oil changes and camshaft replacements.
Yes.
So that led to my next question, which had to do, like we were just talking a little bit earlier about not being able to buy an electric car here. Because you two
I
were
tried.
Yeah, like so.
Yeah.
So I was wondering why, like, what's the story behind that?
Well, it's 2 days before I'm going to pick up my car at the dealership. And I'm in the finance manager's office, and I'm writing the check for the full cost of the car. That goes back to the whole problem with EV1s and a whole bunch of other things that happened prior. I decided I was going to pay cash for the car so that I could make sure that I had full title of the car. So I'm writing the check for the car, and he's giving me a 15-minute lecture on how I'm going to put all of his technicians out of work, and I should be ashamed of myself.
Yeah. Yep.
Here I am buying the first car in Canada, and he's getting all this fanfare. There was newspapers, there was radio, there was TV. Everybody was there watching me get my new car, first one in Canada, and he's getting all this publicity. And he's got to lecture me about putting all his technicians out of work.
Yeah. And I've heard that the only way that Tesla is able to market in a lot of states is by direct marketing, because the dealerships have locked them out of, like, there's no way for them to have dealerships on the ground in a lot of states, because it's that sort of, like, they just don't want to lose the aftermarket business they get with gasoline car, with fossil fuel vehicles.
Well, I know even asking about that Kia Niro, when I was talking to the salesman, and he says, well, we don't have any. And I told him, I said, well, you guys are missing the revolution. And he always says to me, yeah, I know. That's it.
Yep.
Yeah, I know.
Yep.
So they know that everybody, I'm probably not the only guy that asked for one of these things, but people need the change. They want the change. I know one of the things was the charging stations, but I think one of the meetings that I was at with Ross, he showed me this app, and it's charging stations, and it's unbelievable actually how many are available. And yet people, I guess, because you don't see that at every street corner, they think they're not available, like gasoline stations.
So what you're saying is that it's basically, sorry.
Sabotage.
Huh?
I said sabotage.
Well, it's a bunch of people who are just afraid. They're afraid of the change.
Well, they see
Absolutely.
they're going to move. They're going to lose economically. Yeah, they're going to lose income.
Ladies, we have to start car dealerships.
All right, you fill in on Russ.
And
100 years ago, electric cars were more popular than gasoline cars.
Yeah.
And the reason was that nobody liked all of the problems they had with starting and running gasoline-powered cars. So, less able, only the strong could actually use the crank to start a gasoline-powered car. And the invention of the electric starter was the thing that changed the car industry from electric to gasoline. And that also the fact that gasoline was cheaper than electricity in those days. Nowadays, it's much cheaper for electricity, trust me. $80 a year is very affordable.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the infrastructure for electric cars? Like you were talking a little bit about the plug-in stations or battery charging stations, stuff like that. Like I don't know very much about that. I was just wondering.
So there's basically two kinds of chargers. There's level 1, level 2, and level 3, but the two that are important are level 2 and level 3. So a level 2 charger is something that you will use when you go someplace for a period of time. If you're coming to university to listen to a presentation or go to a class or whatever, your car is going to be sitting for a few hours, and you can plug into a level 2 and it will fill your car up. And that works just great. There's lots of level 2 charging stations all over the province. Not in all the appropriate places. I have a bit of a problem with that, but there's a bunch. There's probably 50 in Winnipeg. If you go to plugshare.com, you can actually see all of them.
Are these 220 service?
Yeah, 220 service. And 220 service will fill up my car from completely empty to completely full in 4 hours. I never completely kill, well, nearly never completely kill the battery in my car. The one that's really important is the one for road trips, and that's a level 3 station. There's only one in the province. There's rumors that the U of M is supposed to get one as well, and I don't know if it's actually
Where's the one?
in place. Red River Community College.
Like for public use, or is it?
Yes, it's for public use, and it's also for them to do research on. The level 3 station there will fill up my car in 18 minutes, from completely empty to completely full.
Wow.
And it's actually a fairly small one. It's a 30 kilowatt station. They make 300 kilowatt stations now. My car can't take anything over 200. If you had a 200 kilowatt station, I could fill up my car in 5 minutes. Those things are needed every, I don't know, 100, 200 kilometers on the highway. So there should be one in Portage, there should be one in Brandon, there should be one in Steinbach, there should be one in Selkirk, and so on and so on and so on throughout the entire province.
And see, that's where the solar is starting to take off as well, because they do have inverters now that have a built-in level 2 charger. So you can have a rest station, so to speak, or something,
Yep.
even on the highway, and it can be totally off the grid, and you don't have to worry whether who's going to pay for the electricity, the amount of electricity used. Let's say the government of Manitoba puts it in. No, it's in once, that's it. They can stop by and service it or check, make sure it's okay, but once it's in, it's not like you gotta pay for hydro all the time. It's there.
Yeah, but it doesn't cost that much to fill my car. It
No,
costs
that's-
about $1.25,
No,
right?
right.
Takes 16 kilowatt hours to completely fill my car, times 8 cents, right? It's like $1.25.
I know.
It's really, really affordable to drive my car.
And even if a charging system was developed where it was going to sell you at 30 cents a kilowatt hour.
I don't care, I'd pay
Exactly.
$5. If I could drive to Portage La Prairie and pay $5 and fill up, I would love that, and then I'd drive home.
Right, so in terms of like building a recharging network, it doesn't have to pay for itself based on 8 cents a kilowatt hour, it can pay for itself based on 30 or more
Mhm.
cents a kilowatt hour.
Absolutely.
And ad infinitum, like that from then on, so be quite profitable. And it's actually something that I'm proposing to the provincial government as part of their climate and green plan, is a charging network that's maybe not paid for with carbon revenue, but certainly financed and worked through the utility. And MEVA's got a map developed for where they think these level 3 charging stations should be placed. And using the MEVA map, develop it, and the system will ultimately be profitable for whichever utility takes it on. It just needs the incentive.
Yeah?
Kurt, you were talking about the changing natural gas house heating to electricity, and if I understood you, it would require about doubling the electric generation. Do you have any idea what it would require to change buildings from
Yeah.
natural gas to electricity? Like not in terms of the amount, but what are the nuts and bolts of
Yeah,
what would
what's
have to
the
happen?
strategy, right? Because We want to get off of fossil fuels for heat. How do we keep ourselves from freezing here in Manitoba? Right? That's your question?
Yes. Yes, it is.
And it's a worthwhile objective, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially if you look outside today. This is a more complicated solution here, but because there's actually 5 steps to this, because it's not as simple as just take our existing crappy buildings, and quite frankly, our buildings do not perform well. We've got our entire building stock, even a lot of the new buildings, are not built with energy efficiency in mind. They're built with some kind of aesthetic in mind or something like that. We don't have that focus when it comes to building even new buildings. So increasing the efficiency of our buildings is extremely important. That's the first important step in moving in this direction. And we can move that way for new buildings with things like the energy code. It was only in 2014 when the building code included requirements for energy efficiency. Prior to that, the building code was primarily so that it wouldn't fall on your head. But after 2014, now there's the first time that there's a certain amount of energy performance that's required. And it's actually prescriptive. It's got to be X number of R factor in the walls and the ceiling and stuff like that. But there's other building efficiency standards like Passive House and R2000, etc. There's a few of them where with a Passive House, for example, built if you have a home built to the pre-2014 standards. I don't know how the math works after 2014, but pre-2014 standards, 2x4 walls, etc. If you build a house to that, you'll have a certain amount of energy required. But if you built that house to Passive House, you'd only require 20% of the energy for heating and cooling, as it would have been for a code-built house. Okay, and for a 1,500 square foot home, for example, the most energy that you would need would be about the equivalent of a 4-slice toaster. Well, that would be like a minus 30 day, right? And only for a short period of time, because a Passive House has to also take into account orientation to the sun and solar gain and etc. Thermal mass. So there's building code is essential, and there's also a Passive House for retrofits. So there's a lot of work required in terms of building energy efficiency, building energy labeling. When we buy a home in Europe, buy a building or a home, they have just the same as you got your fridge, your Energy Star on your fridge. They have that for homes. You can't sell a home or a building without a label to know what the performance of that building is supposed to be. And there's a lot of techniques, construction techniques that our industry just doesn't know. We need training in it and experience in it. And then the market needs to pull. So the market needs to pull, the building trades need to change. So that's only the first step, okay? Second step are things like solar walls, passive solar. Like there's a building downtown here, you'll see when you come over the Midtown Bridge, there's a building you can see with a black south-facing wall. And the heating system is well, you still have to do air exchanges on any building. But the air that goes into the heating system is preheated by solar, passive solar that heats on that black wall. So as the air comes up, it's heated all the way up, and then it goes into the air intake for the building. So basically every building should have some kind of a solar wall. Another thing is, the third step is district heating. Instead of having a heating source in every building, there needs to be a central neighborhood or district heating plant, and then hot water and glycol that distributes that heat and cooling to the other buildings in the network, with a geothermal component to it. So that the geothermal is the fourth element of this thing. Like the district heating, actually downtown Winnipeg was on a district heating loop up until very recently. These pipes are still in tunnels underneath Main Street. Because there used to be a coal-fired plant. I don't know if you remember. I remember the day when there used to be a big smokestack near the foot of the Disraeli Freeway. There was a big. That was a plant that was a heat plant, and it piped hot water to most of the banks and office buildings in the downtown area. something like that would work, especially in rural municipalities. And the last section is biomass. Using biomass like waste, straw, wood waste, cattails can be harvested sustainably, still replenished into the soil. So there's five elements to be able to heat and cool our buildings, and that doesn't even take into account things like proper co-location. Like classic example is a curling rink next to a swimming pool, right? Where you've got something that wants to get rid of heat, the curling rink, and the swimming pool that wants to gain heat, and you co-locate them, and the one is benefiting the other by being close together. Or a hydro transformer station wants to get rid of heat next to a building, apartment block or something, right? So there's lots of that. That's not even in that equation, but it's things like that that are ultimately required to keep from freezing in the dark.
Anyone else have a question?
Hi, Mike.
Yeah.
You had touched briefly about grid capacitance and having like a battery bank in your home. This is for on-grid setups. Do you think that's something that makes sense in Manitoba, having like a Tesla Powerwall, or with being able to put energy back into the grid and take it back out, sort of like a piggy bank? It's more of a non-solution for Manitoba.
I don't see a other than maybe if you want to make yourself like disaster proof or something like that. So if you want to make sure that you can make a smoothie when the power goes out or something like that. I mean, but we have got one of the most reliable power systems on the planet here. Having said that, there is a risk with regards to ice storms. And even with Bipole 3, which is supposed to be a redundancy aspect to it, it's so close to Bipole 1, like that. I don't see where, if we had an ice storm like they had in the 90s in Quebec and Ontario, we still would all be out of power. So there is that aspect too. But for the city of Winnipeg, I don't think there's enough roof space to provide the full-on the power that we need with solar, and we have to duplicate the generating capacity anyways for the problem. What I'm saying is, for places off grid and like remote communities, there's really a tremendous argument for solar, even far north. In the introduction, we mentioned the project in Lac Brochet, which is at the same latitude as Churchill. The project that we've got under construction right now is to replace about 30% of the heating requirement for that community. It's a community of 850 people, with biomass and geothermal and solar and there's the biggest solar array in the province being constructed there, even though it's at that latitude. And that power is primarily to power the new system that's going in there, the heating plant and the lagoon for it. So there's for diesel communities, for remote communities, there's a lot of there's a really good argument for solar and wind, especially in the far north where you've got a lot of wind, and in the wintertime not a lot of sun.
I thought, because I tend to just think about, this Winnipeg urban environment, but like all the applications that like all three of you are talking about, like in remote communities where it's so costly to, let's say, connect to a grid, or have all kinds of like where you wouldn't have like gas stations, or gas is really hard to come by, or all these sort of inhibitors. But with these new methods of having your energy needs met, there's like some really dynamic, I think, opportunities there. And I was kind of hoping that you'd mention something about Lac Brochet, or even some of. So are you also connected to build? Is that Kind of.
Bill is associated with that key and
Yeah, yeah,
Sean Loney and
yeah.
Darcy Wood.
Because I heard him talk about like some of the geothermal that is being put into the reserves and some of the obstacles that are faced, and you know, it's and I
That's
think
not, by that way, that's not happening anymore?
Mm.
That's fallen to pieces because of INAC.
to
What?
go ahead.
Well, because
Yeah.
that operation that Aki was doing, setting up social enterprises in the First Nations, doing the training for the people doing the installations, the maintenance and operation of the geothermal, and most of the funding for that was provided by the PAYS system from Hydro. So they would finance it, and then because they're replacing power that would have been used for heating from Hydro.
Yep.
Right, so the PAYS system would finance it.
Yep.
And pay as you save. But INAC said, no, you can't do that. You can't receive that funding that way. We will fund it. So what I've heard is that instead of getting 200 homes done in a year, INAC finances it completely and does 4. Now, I don't want to paint INAC as the villain completely, because there's a lot of good folks in INAC who are doing good work. But in this particular instance, I can't see the rationale.
Yeah.
This particular decision that was made seems very paternalistic, and it's another colonial
Yeah.
piece of bullshit.
Yeah, as Sean Looney says, just get out of our way.
Yeah, yeah.
We'll do the work.
Because it was a really inspiring
Mhm.
example of
Yeah.
self-reliance, self-sufficiency for these communities, and they were going gangbusters on it.
Yeah.
And you can see people with employment and
Yeah.
looking after their own needs. It's
Yeah.
not happening anymore. And Aki is in trouble because of it. Like, there's just the amount of work that they're not doing that anymore.
Do you have a solution for that? Do you have a workaround? Do you have I don't know, like, what do you do? Like, how do you, in the face
Well, I
of-
mean, I'm currently working on a project that we're investigating with IISD, with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, for the Interlake First Nations. We're a biomass heating solution using cattails and waste wood and grasses for a central heat plant for those First Nations. It is potentially viable, because then the harvesting of the biomass is employment for the community, and also another aspect of self-reliance. The Black Brochet project is using waste wood. It's not waste wood, it's burnt wood. So like in Black Brochet, it's almost at the tree line, but it's not at the tree line. And when a forest fire goes through, well, the trees, a really mature tree is like that. And it's about a meter, they're about a meter apart. When a forest fire goes through, it will be hot enough to kill the trees, but not hot enough to burn the tree. And so after a forest fire goes through, you'll see these black sticks all over the place. And that'll be the fuel for the biomass heat plant in Lac Brochet that will be harvested by the people in the community, going out in the wintertime with so minimal disturbance of the soil and undergrowth. Cut the burnt wood, stack it, skid it, stack it, and collect it into the system. And the estimate that we worked with Manitoba Forestry, with the current available burnt wood within 12 kilometers of the town site, if they were to burn 10% of the available wood stock, burnt wood stock, that's enough energy for the requirement of this project for 200 years.
Whoa.
And it provides self-reliance that no longer requires diesel and the ground contamination that goes along with it, and self-reliance and self-employment. And the construction is being done right now with people from the community.
So now how is it that you can move forward with that, but you can't move forward with the geothermal with Manitoba Hydro? Is it all to do with financing?
Financing, yeah. It's all to do with financing. You see, in the case of Lac Brochet, the financing is because of soil remediation costs. INAC has to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars every time there's there's a diesel spill, because they have to remediate the soil. But if you can reduce the amount of diesel in the community, you reduce that liability. So it's a forward-thinking investment, and so that's where the financing is coming from, is to reduce that reliance on diesel, and therefore reduce your liability and risk for soil contamination. So that works in a diesel community, but it won't work in a community that's not got that kind of liability.
I have a question just on burning the wood is a carbon dioxide. So isn't that a bad, just a negative footprint? on the
Well,
environment?
don't forget that when you burn wood or burn any biomass, you're talking basically a net zero carbon footprint, depending upon what it takes to grow. Like if you're just taking a tree that grew naturally, the amount of carbon that's in the tree has come from the atmosphere and the soil. And then when it dies, that carbon goes back into the atmosphere and the soil. So it's basically a net zero. And the same kind of thing holds for a properly managed biomass source if it's managed in a sustainable way. There's enough carbon going back into the soil for future generations of that plant, whether it's a tree or cattail or whatever. And as long as you don't use fossil fuels for any kind of equipment that you're using for managing and harvesting that. So there's, it's not quite zero, but it's close to zero,
And
or it can be.
Yeah, just another comment on the hydro projects that you were talking about earlier. That I actually knew an engineer who was working on those numbers and the doing all that measurement of what that that hydro project was actually, he found not it wasn't sustainable, and they didn't actually need it. The things that you're actually saying right now, he wasn't listened to, because someone who was in the higher up was just refusing. He wanted that project to happen. It was a legacy thing or something. And yeah, so it's interesting to hear about the electric, and that we have more than enough. And I think it's just that we have to have that kind of tipping point feeling again, happening in our province or in our provinces, to move ahead with what we all know is the only way that we can, sustain ourselves and our future. So anyway, just I really appreciated all your information and the things I'm learning here tonight. Thank you.
To rewind just for a second, one of the things that's difficult for a lot of people to understand is that the amount of carbon that's released when you compost a tree is exactly the same amount that's released when you burn a tree.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it composts and turns into soil and eventually all dissipates, or whether you put it in your furnace and you burn it, you have the same amount of CO2 in the air. What's different is the rate at which it's put into the air. And if you're taking a small amount out of a forest, like he was talking about, 10% will last 200 years. If you're taking a small amount out of the forest, the impact to the environment is negligible.
Because you can't forget about the carbon in the soil too.
Mhm.
Yeah. And that's where you take a percentage of it off and burn it, and the rest you allow to decompose.
So, okay, so if you're burning, if you're burning wood in your fire pit, they talk about some places where they banned fireplaces because it was just too many pollutants going up into the air. Is that just because it's a really inefficient burn,
Yeah.
as opposed to a biomass where you can burn it so it's basically
It's primarily
Clean.
the temperature of combustion.
okay?
If an open fire pit or something like that, it's really low temperature burn.
Mhm.
But if you've got a closed high efficiency furnace
Mhm.
that's running at an efficient temperature. There's very little smoke and particulate that come out the end of the top of the chimney. You know, there might be some at the startup when it's getting going, and then cool down. But for the most part, these modern biomass furnaces are very high efficiency and therefore not that much particulates and that kind of contaminants.
Anybody else have any questions? I have a couple more from Dave. If you don't mind, I'd
Sure.
kind of do it to wrap it up. Okay, so he was asking, but just this is generally to anyone or everybody. What should provincial government be doing to encourage the rapid move away from fossil fuel use?
Can I start?
Yeah.
Number one on my list would have to be to stop the Manitoba Petroleum Fiscal Regimen. What this is a financial system that's existed in our province for, I don't know, a long time, 50 years or something. It was last increased in April 28th, 2016, so that there's more money put into the location, the extraction, and the transportation of crude oil in the province. It's crucial that if we're going to compare gasoline-powered cars versus electric-powered cars, or natural gas furnaces versus wood furnaces, that in the beginning we have to level the playing field. We have to stop subsidizing fossil fuels and make them pay all of their proper taxes and royalties, and don't give them any cash subsidies or incentives. That would be my number one on the list of things to do.
Here, I thought you were going to talk about cars. Some of the when you start looking at some of that stuff, some of the biggest fleets owned in Manitoba are owned by governments. The city of Winnipeg has a huge fleet.
Mm-hmm.
The Manitoba government has a huge fleet. Get them converting all to electric cars. A lot of those things, like especially the city of Winnipeg, it's all urban. It's every one of them is just travels in the city. So there's no reason why they shouldn't convert to electric cars. The province, I guess I would wager a bet that it'd probably be about 75-25. They still need a lot of rural travel, but a lot of their vehicles still are in the city, and there's no reason why they couldn't convert these fleets to electric. I know transit, I worked there for 24 years. They have, you're right, they have 4 electric buses. There's no reason why they couldn't, when purchasing new buses and replacing them. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason to just have a perfectly good bus crushed and then replace it with an electric one, but as they come up for renewal, there's no reason why they shouldn't replace them with electric buses. They're working fine.
Well,
Your fuel savings, your maintenance savings for something like Winnipeg Transit would be huge.
Oh, it's
And they
absolutely-
more than offset the initial upfront cost of the bus.
Well, the government released the Climate and Green Plan a couple of weeks ago, and in that document, there's a proposal for 100 electric buses.
Mhm.
So that's, but it's
I
not
hope
as
it comes true.
well, yeah, but it's not as simple as just replacing the bus, because the economics are hands down make huge economic sense. Especially if you take the whole life cycle of the bus into account, and the maintenance and the reliability issues with the Cummins pollution controls on the Cummins diesel. But you also have to look into a charging network,
Mhm.
and go along with the network, a change to the routing. And there's actually work afoot. I'm working with a few people at Transit and elsewhere, ex-Hydro employees and New Flyer, to work on all 3 of those elements, the vehicle, the charging, and network changes. but all three have to be done in order for the system to be efficient. But ultimately, that is by far a beneficial suggestion for the province. I've kind of got a whole shopping list of things that the province should do along the lines of the list of the fleet that you're talking about. Not just convert to electric, but make more of those government fleet vehicles available to Peg City Car Co-op or a similar car share. Because one of the limitations of the car share solution is the proximity to the car. And right now it's dedicated to how many cars that Peg City owns and how far and then the density of living. Whereas if you've got fleet vehicles, other fleets, that you could make an economic case to say that these vehicles can either from 5 o'clock in the evening until 9 o'clock in the morning sit in a parking lot someplace, or you can have them sit in a parking lot someplace and be available to a car share to book them and use them and have them as a revenue source for the owners of the fleet. And by so doing, you've got a new revenue stream for the fleet owners, but you've also got a significant increase in the catchment area for a car share. So that's another example.
Go ahead.
I just, in addition to that, I had thought of the Peg City Co-op, car co-op earlier myself, and I was thinking, now wouldn't that be great for them to start to also move towards having their fleet be electric as well?
One of the issues though with
They have one.
They do have.
yeah, they do. They
Okay.
They have a Chevy Volt.
Okay. Yeah.
It's one out of, I don't know, dozens.
But it's a little bit more complicated with the car share scenario than it is for people who own passenger cars. Because people who own passenger cars typically only, even at the max, they'll be using it for what, 2 hours a day, 2 hours out of every 24. Whereas when you get into a car share, part of the reason that it's now much more efficient for all of the members of the car share is that car is used more hours in the day, but shared amongst more people. But so it's not, I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's not as simple as the equation for the rationale for somebody like Ross to own a car, to own an electric vehicle, because he's only using it for a very short period of time in the day, and therefore the rest of the time is available for recharging. Whereas if it's a car share, you've got to then set up your booking schedule with spaces for recharging, right? So that the vehicle can recharge during the day. I'm not saying, it just makes it a little more complicated.
I would.
Because the duty cycle for the vehicle is a little
For that, I would have thought the vehicle would be stationed, where it is plugged in, and then it'd be taken.
It
And-
is,
yeah.
but you just
Yeah.
have to make your booking system
Yeah.
more cognizant of the need
Sure.
for recharging.
Sure, okay.
Well, unless you had so many cars available that you could have, let's say, two parked together, one is charging, the other one is available.
Exactly, yeah, something like that. But
Like I know, like I'm part of the car share, and I have cousins who are part of that in Vancouver, where they've got to the point there where you only book your car from point A to point B.
yeah,
I
that's
have
car
to
to
book
go,
the
right?
car here from point A to point B, B back to A.
Yeah.
So I pay for when it's just sitting, but they have like enough cars in Vancouver that they don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was visiting my cousin in Vancouver, and she has the Yugo thing, so she gets her phone or her tablet and walks up to the car, because there's so many of them around, and they just park wherever. Of course, within a certain zone, but it's so dense, you can just take the car. We went to dinner and then left it there and walked back, and somebody else would get it. So I guess density matters too, because Winnipeg's famously not dense in its population, so that's another challenge, I suppose, but yeah.
We just parked it in the public street?
Yeah, they got a deal with the city. You get to just park, they park them wherever you want. So they have several car co-op, car share kind of situations there. And it's making a lot of sense, especially for such a dense area. To own your own vehicle and to store it is crazy. It's like, yeah, you're right, 10% of the time, right? That's
Yeah.
when it's being used.
Did you have more on your list of, go ahead, I'm curious, right?
Yeah.
So one last point
Sure,
about
yeah.
the car share.
Yeah.
The cars that first came out 5 years ago when I got my car, they had about 150 kilometer range or something like that. So recharging was a big deal. A lot of the cars that are coming out now are 300 kilometer cars. And so it's fine if it's used a lot during the day and then it sits and it recharges overnight. You can easily refill a 300 kilometer car in about 6 to 8 hours, depending on the car and the charger. There's a few little details to work out, but somewhere in that neighborhood.
Do you think the size, like the power in the battery and the cost of the battery is going to follow the pattern it's following? Like in 10 years, are we going to have a 1,000-kilometer battery and it's going to cost like pennies?
Well, it's going to continue to fall. Because it's reducing by percentages, it will never go to pennies. The range is not increasing as quickly as is possible, and that's because the space allocated inside the vehicle is actually reducing. So the volume of the batteries is getting smaller, but because of the power increases that are becoming because of chemistry improvements and a bunch of other things, is leading to batteries that have double the capacity but only 3/4 of the size.
Well, we talked about the charging system,
Yeah.
right? Having you use the MIVA map and finance the charging system. We talked about transit and the move to electrifying transit and funding, renewing the 50/50 operating funding for transit, which was lost in the current budget. Prior to that, for the last at least decade, probably more, the provincial government guaranteed Winnipeg Transit 50% of their operating cost would be covered by the province. In the most recent budget, the province changed that to a fixed amount. And so immediately, because of inflation and other cost increases, the Winnipeg Transit has seen an $8 million a year operating reduction. And so that, first and foremost, has to be restored. And then further incentive, and I'm saying there's going to be carbon revenue with what was just announced in the Climate and Green Plan, with $25 a ton on carbon. We're talking about $250 million of new revenue. Now that could be, depending on how the provincial government budgets it, it can be revenue neutral. That is to say, we've got this $250 million that comes from a new source, but they can budget to reduce income taxes or something else, some other source of revenue to offset it so that you have not got a net increase in taxes. That's a scenario. But you've got this source of revenue that's coming from carbon polluters, right? And it would make sense, just in terms of fairness, that money should be reinvested to help people get away from that cost. And the best way to do it for urban dwellers is to make your transit system better, and make your transit system greener, make it more electric, right? So an investment in that charging system and the redesign of the network, et cetera, is all part of the solution. And something along like the network is the creation of a frequent service network. In July, Winnipeg City Council passed a motion instructing transit within 18 months to give back a report on the creation of a frequent service network. And what that means is that, for example, in Montreal, they've got a 10-minute max network. Most of the island is set up so that you've got very frequent and simple east-west routes and very simple and frequent north-south routes. They guarantee you that anywhere on that grid, if you go and stand at a bus stop, that within 10 minutes you'll get a bus from 6 a.m. till 9 p.m. weekdays, and like very long span and really good service. And it's really simple, no redundancy on these routes. There's only one bus, not one bus, but one bus route on a particular street,
Okay.
okay?
As
And-
opposed to here, like Portage Avenue, you've got like 5 buses.
Exactly. I took the bus here, and I could have probably, 3 buses went by, and I wasn't 100% sure if they were gonna take me where I wanted to go. Probably both of them would have, 2 out of the 3 would have taken me, but I didn't know that. But with the Montreal network, you know that it's just gonna go this, very simply, east-west, 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 very, very rapidly, north-south. So you make one you walk to the route, take the bus, make one connection, you'll get from anywhere to anywhere with very minimal width. And what that does is it changes how you approach transit. In Winnipeg, you've got to take like a master's degree in transit and have an app, and then you go like, I don't think that the connection's going to be too. I'm just not going to do it because it's too tight. I can't count on myself making that, and then I'm going to have to wait 25 minutes in the cold, right? It's a whole different. The way you approach transit in Winnipeg is different than you would in Montreal, where you just go, I don't even need an app for this. I know where I'm going to, and then in places like Berlin, where they've got the same kind of thing. On the bus, you've got all of the routes that are going to connect at a particular stop. So you know, if I want, okay, I take the 200 and then I take the XL, this is my stop, right? It's all very, very clear. You don't have to have a master's degree. And the creation of a frequent service network along these lines would do that. And it would be and it could be, if we're going to go to a frequent service network, design it to be compatible with electrification, so that you place your transit transfer points in many cases at the same places you've got your charging stations, so that they all sort of work together. Because you can't just take the buses and electrify them unless you've got a system and capacity in your batteries so that they all can be charged at the depot. So they all got to go back to the depot to charge.
There is a lot of areas, like a lot of the routes have layover spots, loops and bus loops and whatnot. There's no reason why they couldn't put the charging stations right at the bus loops, and when the driver's got his 10-minute break or whatever, he's charging the bus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's what happens currently on the 20 route.
On the 20 route, yeah, they got the one at the airport and one, just the one at the airport.
I think it's just the one at the airport.
Just the one at the airport,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's really simple.
Yeah.
Park the
Oh,
bus,
yeah.
fill her
Yeah.
up.
But there's, the bus loops are everywhere, and every one of them has its own wait times and whatnot.
Right.
And when you talk about it, like Hydro would have to supply it, right?
Yeah.
Right? So you could, like at places like Polo Park, St. Vital, Kildonan, Health Sciences, like you can find certain places that strategically would make sense as far as the network is concerned, but also make it relatively easy for Hydro to upgrade the system for the power required in order to do the charging for the buses. So, but that would require a certain amount of financing, not necessarily actual, payment, but certainly financing. Because I think the utility would pay for itself, like at 30 cents a kilowatt or whatever it is they would have to sell. They could sell the power back to transit. Transit still make a lot less, reduce their operating costs, but the utility would make a lot of money on this thing over the long term.
I guess you have no idea on how much, the kind of savings that would mean for transit. Like for the amount of money that they spend on gas right now, like you probably don't have those numbers.
I don't know what transit pays for their fuel. I mean, I'm sure they probably get a bulk rate, but each bus uses, I would estimate an average about 150 liters a day. And you've got
It's closer to
500 to
400.
500 to 600 buses running every day. So you're talking quite a bit of fuel.
The economics just are hands down.
No, it's
just
you can watch 4 tanker trucks a day go into transit and fill up. Yeah. So they do go through, and that's just at the Fort Rouge garage. There's also the North garage as well,
Wow.
which is a smaller garage, but there's still 100 buses that run out of there. So it is a lot. I mean, some of the buses they'll run 2-3 days, and that's 400 liters, easy.
So what do you think would be standing, like, is the obstacle to not shifting over to like electric buses? Is it just like
The
a
charging-
lack
I
of
think it
will?
really,
charging
like I
network.
said,
It's
the
the
elec-
charging
the
network.
charging stations, yeah, that would be the big holdup, the big drawback for that. Because the bus itself, they make them, it's just a matter of how you charge them. And
The thinking within transit as well, they still voice the opinion that they're not convinced that they'll actually work.
Yeah.
Even though the 20, Route 20 watt that goes to the airport has been surprisingly successful. I mean, even transit, when they took it on, were very skeptical about, especially in the wintertime, whether they were going to be reliable and warm and then all the rest of it. And it turned out to be much more successful than they even anticipated it being.
I still hear that.
you know,
Absolutely,
saying-
they still
Well,
say
It's
that.
cold out. How can batteries work in the cold? It's like we've had a Prius hybrid for 20 years. Like it's been in Winnipeg for 20 years, and we've had a Prius, the Toyota Prius hybrid electric is, like it's not a problem anymore. They make batteries that can last in the cold.
well, and that's the thing, and like especially with the lithium battery, they're not as affected by the cold as what batteries used to be. So, I mean, they're just simply not affected. And then, like you say, every route they go, the 20, it's charging up. So when the batteries are charging, they're getting warm.
And there's another aspect of the current diesel buses they have, is the new Cummins diesel is very unreliable. Because they've over time they've put more and more restrictions on pollution controls on diesel. And now Cummins Motor Company is the only one that has accepted the challenge of supplying these engines for buses, and they're not reliable. Transit is paying through the nose for them because they break down on a very, very regular basis, and Cummins isn't paying for it's not covered under warranty, and it's Cummins mechanics and Cummins material that's being paid for by transit to keep these buses on the road. And it used to be that buses would last 1 million kilometers. The new ones are 300,000.
Wow.
But with electric, you go back to 1 million plus. In fact, they haven't been on the road long enough for them to fail. But they're saying that they'll be on the road at least 1 million kilometers. And so if you factor things like your maintenance, like you're not going to have to do oil changes, you're not going to have to suffer the breakdowns of the pollution controls, the longevity of this lasts 3 times as long, the economics of the bus, hands down, there's no comparison.
But I remember last year around this time when we had the first big huge snowfall, and everybody was complaining about how bad the bus service was that day. It's like, it's not like we didn't know that we were going to have a huge snow dump. Like they had been predicting it all week, but I remember waiting for a bus to go out to East Kildone, and I waited for like an hour and a half at the concert hall because all the buses were full. And then what the city came back and said was that they had so many buses that were out of service at that time because they were all in maintenance and they didn't have enough mechanics.
And that was the Cummins problem.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, don't forget too, Cummins also had, to meet emissions, they made them all super efficient and everything else, but then they added what they call a regen system that kind of cleans it out. But that just basically dumps raw fuel in and burns it, and it stinks bad.
Yeah, and
But but they can get away with that with their emissions calculations because that's not part of the engine. So it is really bad. It's really bad. Like when you see some of the ones where you have a smaller tailpipe coming out the bottom and it's just spewing tons of black smoke.
Oh, yeah.
That's the regen firing up, and it's an emission thing that cleans up
the evolution of diesel engines has been a real mixed bag because as time has gone on, like there's studies that show that diesel particulates is a carcinogen, right? So there's been all kinds of, a lot of these pollution controls are to reduce the particulates, right? But in order to reduce the particulates, the engines are less efficient fuel-wise. So over time, the diesel engines have become more efficient as all internal combustions have become more efficient, but then they add this pollution control requirement on it and the efficiency falls again. So you get them cleaner exhaust, but but more fuel is being poured through them per kilometer in order to keep them running. So you've got this sort of, and now they've really reached the technological, I think, limit of diesel as far as clean and efficiency. That's as far as they can go, and that's where the opportunity for electric is huge.
Were you gonna ask something?
Yeah, I was thinking, there's a few cities that have said that they're going to ban the sale of internal combustion engine vehicles in like 2030, 2040.
A lot of European cities are that.
Yeah, and that's
entire countries.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think even before that, they're talking.
Well, then there's like, how would that affect, you know, well, obviously it's going to affect the Cummins company. They're going to have to move production to lithium ion eventually, but
Cummins is busy working on electric powertrains
okay.
today.
Okay.
And there are a lot of the car companies there working on electric vehicles, right? Yeah.
GM just
Some,
announced.
some more enthusiastically
Yeah.
than others.
Yeah,
Hmm.
but even GM, and that's the biggest volume in the world. GM, there are two new models next year and 18 new models by 2022 or something, 2025, something like that.
Yep.
So they're committed to electrification in a big way.
Well, yeah, as soon as you have a country that makes a decision to go one way, you know, to go greener,
And an important country is
Yeah.
China.
yeah.
We were
China's supposed to do 2025, 0 new vehicles. By 2030, they're going to eliminate all internal combustion engine vehicles.
Really?
Yes.
Oh.
So you can't buy a new
Like
one after
eliminate old ones,
2025,
like actually
and
shut
they
them
will actually eliminate all the old ones
And if
by
you think about
2030.
You know, in the United States has decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. And it's the only country in the world now, it was just announced today
Syria
that
just
Syria
signed.
has signed on.
Yeah.
In 2015, when it was initially signed, there were only 2 countries that didn't sign it, Syria and Nicaragua. And Nicaragua didn't sign it because they said it didn't go far enough, and Syria had other things on their mind, right? Civil war. And since then, Nicaragua said, well, this is the only game in town, okay, we'll sign on. And today, Syria signed on. So the United States is the only country in the world who does not see the future.
No,
And if China is investing in a future like this in such a big way, in a very few years, the United States will be a technological backwater.
Yeah.
But what
They're
about
losing this opportunity.
what about California though? Like, what if California decides to sign on?
Absolutely.
There are 10 or 11 states
Yeah.
that are going to go
They'll be the saving
fossil
grace, if
fuel
anything, for the United States.
free.
Yes.
And so what's going to happen is the guy that lives in Texas will not be able to drive to California or Oregon or New York. They just won't be able to drive their pickup truck there or whatever they're operating.
You can tell how backwards the States is just by looking at some of the news clips. You know, you look at even Florida, when they were having the big the hurricane and whatnot. If you look at the news clips where the guys were putting gas in their vehicles, you didn't see Toyota Priuses, you didn't see little Honda Civics. You saw every one of them had a great big 4x4, 4-door pickup. And you got to kind of wonder, what do you guys need all those for? Like, there's some people that legitimately use pickups and everything else, but this was, you look at the lineup at the gas station and they're all 4x4 pickups. And you know they're backwards. It's just a no-brainer.
But California seems to have set the standard for fuel efficiency in the past, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if they decide to do it, like I heard somewhere that their public servant retirement fund is bigger than France's economy or something. Like, there's a lot of people in California. There's a lot of stuff happening. So they could set the tone even if the federal government isn't able to do anything. But that could change quickly.
Well, and then I also, for me, it comes to mind, like, not forgetting just individuals' choices. And I think of that because when I watched the Stanford video that David sent to me about the guy talking about, you know, this projection for the solar self-driving car, he showed 2 pictures of the same street in New York City, and one year it was like, can you find the car? on the street, and there was one car, and the next picture was, can you find the horse? And there was one horse.
It was 13 years apart.
Yeah,
So one was all horses and one car in
Yeah.
the picture, and then 13 years later it was flipped over.
yeah,
And they're saying the same thing about 2030.
yeah.
So, you know, it's 2017 right now, 13 years. He predicted there'll be like a lot fewer cars on the road because everybody's gonna, well, a lot of things.
Yeah, but I think like in that instance of those two photographs, that's not talking a lot about government intervention, but it's the individual's choice. They just said, oh, well, the car is a better option for me than the horse. And you just,
Well, and I think that's the reason why the car is a
Yeah.
better option here as opposed to transit, is because, like you said, you're waiting 25 or a half an hour and a half for a bus. The routes themselves, if somebody's got to go to U of M and they live in Tyndall Park, well, that's a 3-hour bus ride. Well, if I take my car, it's 25 minutes,
Yeah.
30 minutes. Well, it's kind of a no-brainer if you don't want to get up at 5 in the morning to take a bus to be a class for 8. It does have to change. Transit thinking does have to change. Their routes have to change. Their buses have to change. The whole, I guess, the ideology of how these things work needs to change in order for us to shy away from cars or make it, I'll say, less attractive to take your car than it would be to take a bus. I know when out in my area they built Ridgewood South. And one of my first questions was, where's the bus route going to be? And the transit representative said, there is no bus route here. So 40,000 people will not have bus access unless they want to walk a mile to Grant or to Dale and Rannoch and catch the bus. That makes no sense.
Yeah.
Plan it so that you have a bus route and people will take the bus.
Yeah.
And like I say, the frequency as well.
One thing that came to mind for me was having more feeder buses that bring, if people don't have the access to the mainstream buses, have those feeder buses operating to bring people to a stop. And I mean, in places like Calgary where they did light rail transit, I think it's called. Oh, yeah. And, you know, they have these big substations that really bring people, you know, to this location, and then they're not piling in to the downtown. They're coming in on the light rail. We don't have that here, but the thing we can do is at least feed people to and give people access.
As long as the neighborhood is designed for it.
Yeah.
Because some of the form of the subdivision is such that you simply cannot service it with transit.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
Well, as noticed, I've been living in BC actually for the last 7 years, and I come into Winnipeg and back and forth. But one of the things that I noticed is the sprawling city as I drive the perimeter and find Bishop Grand and checking out these new Waverly neighborhoods, and we just seem to be expanding in where things can't be serviced.
Because they often, when they make these developments where the road system is so serpentine, there's that even if you put a feeder bus on it, it takes you 20 minutes for the bus to make it through the development.
Yeah.
I got lost in one of those once. So I was trying to go to U of M from Waverly, and I'm in this like.
Oh, yeah.
And quite frankly, if you're gonna, if for those residents, in order to have transit service, what you have to abandon the idea of them having a bus going through the development. Instead, you have to develop cut-throughs and pathways so they can walk or cycle to a frequent service stop.
To a hub.
Yeah.
That's what they need, is a transit hub in each neighborhood.
So they have to change the way that they get to the transit, and then they'll enjoy part of a frequent service network. So if you can walk or cycle through cut-throughs and pathways through your development, and have secure lock for your bike or something like that, or a pleasant place to sit if you're, it's only going to be 10 minutes anyways, and get on a frequent service network.
like speaking of urban planning, one of the things that I did this year, I was in both the Netherlands and Germany. And the experience of like being in a totally differently structured city I thought some of the offshoots of that was really interesting, like in Berlin, because it's such a high density city, we got the car that we had rented, we got rid of it the first day because there was absolutely no place to park a car. Nothing.
And
Nothing.
bus and transit and subway is so convenient.
Oh, it's super convenient. It felt really safe. It was super cheap as well because you could buy like a week pass and just use it like as many times as you want. But then the offshoot of it that I didn't expect was that the city itself is really quiet.
Yep.
Because everybody is trying to park their car. If you've got a car, they try to park it and they don't move it because it's so hard to find a parking spot. And then you do something else, right? Like you take the mass transit. Or you don't have a car at all. So in the evenings, if you looked out the window, like here, all evening I've been watching all these cars go by. In the evening, there would probably be like 5 cars or 6 cars, like no cars moving, which is a really, not something that I expected at all, but that's what I mean by like these odd offshoots of this different kind of
Well,
plan.
and part of that too is like what Ross was mentioning, is his car makes no noise. Myself, it still kind of freaks me out a bit because when I worked on buses, diesel buses for 24 years, and I've been beside an electric bus, and it just kind of, it's really weird to me that this huge monstrosity pulls away and there's no noise. And myself, I guess because I've worked on them for so many years, in my mind, I'm expecting this great big roar and rumble of the bus, and all I see is this thing just pulling away and no noise. So when you could build, when you start talking about rural or urban neighborhoods and whatnot, you could build them so the houses aren't affected. Like people aren't going to say, I don't want a bus running down my front street, because they won't even hear the bus
Yeah.
running down their front street anymore.
Yeah. Maybe you have to equip it with like little bird chirps or so.
Well, yeah.
Mine actually purrs like a kitten, but most people can't even hear it. It's so subtle. There's a speaker in the grill, and it makes noise, and it meets all the legal requirements.
Oh, that's
But it literally sounds like a kitten, and it's
Yeah, because they add a noise so that pedestrians won't be hit by them. Like,
Yeah.
Unexpectedly, they'll
Yeah.
step off the
right.
curb.
But guess what? It's not a deterrent.
Yeah.
You still manage to hit people?
You still have to drive like everybody's deaf. It's just the way you have to drive.
Are there any other questions? It's pretty much 9 o'clock. I don't know, did you guys want to say anything, wrap up, or
I'm sure we could talk for
for
hours.
hours? No,
So there was one important question,
Yeah.
and that was,
Yeah.
what's the biggest obstacle to change in Manitoba?
Yeah.
And from the point of view of adoption of electric vehicles, most people don't even know they exist. They don't realize that you can go to the dealer and buy one as long as you argue with them for a couple of days. And most people have never ridden in one, and they've never seen one. They go by on the street, but they don't even recognize them. One of the things that MEBA does is we have something called MEBA Fest. Every fall, the weekend in September when Minifest is downtown, we're part of that festival, and we show off all our favorite cars and trucks and SUVs and buses, and I took my boat last year. And so people can see firsthand that there are electric vehicles. One of the things I would like all of you to do is, I have a little printout. It's not fancy, but it's got the right information on it, and I would like you to share this with your friends and help them become educated about electric vehicles. I will give each of you a handful of these that you can share with your friends and family and whatever.
Well, and on that note, like the biggest obstacle to change, that my comment is the biggest obstacle to change is complacency. And the biggest reason for complacency is that people don't, well, there's 2 aspects. People, here in the province, they don't see the climate impacts that are as severe as they are in other parts of the world, where we're talking literally about life and death
Yeah.
kinds of impacts. But there's the other contributor to that complacency is the artificially low cost of fossil fuels. That I mean, Ross talked about the subsidies for fossil fuels, which are still going on, even though there's commitments, supposedly commitments to remove them internationally and nationally. But there's an essential part of this solution, the climate solution, is to put a price on carbon pollution, and we have to celebrate the fact that we now are very close to having a price on carbon pollution here in Manitoba. There's a lot of debate about the particular pricing schedule that is being proposed by the provincial government, but there will be a price on carbon pollution here in Manitoba. The province next to us has decided to fight against it. They're not going to be successful in most, but they are challenging it constitutionally to do with taxing other government agencies, is the way that they're approaching it. But their intention is to fight against it. So that's something to celebrate. But if we're gonna move away from fossil fuels, there's only two ways to do it. One of them is to regulate supply, and they did that in World War II with rationing. It can be done in various ways, where you limit the number of liters of gasoline and diesel that's available per year, for example. Is that going to happen? Not very likely. The other way is to make the cost of the fossil fuel more expensive than the alternative. And the only way for that to happen is through carbon pricing. And with a carbon price that will ramp up over time. It has to scale up. And a different study from Stanford says that the current price of carbon should be about $220 US a ton today. Okay, but we have to move in that direction. And even at $200 a ton, we're only talking about 50 cents a liter additional cost at $200 a ton.
And what are they setting it? What's the
Well, the federal government is suggesting $10 a ton to start, going up by $10 a ton per year. And at $10 a ton, that adds about 2.5 cents a liter for your gasoline. It goes up that in an afternoon. So if you go up, so that's at $10 a ton. So at $100 a ton, we're talking about 25 cents a liter. Well, it was $1.50 in 2008, right? And people were still driving. Anyways, but we can't count on the market to bring the price up. It has to be done by public policy, and the revenue should come back to public policy, so that we can recycle the revenue in ways that'll help us move away from our dependence on fossil fuels, because the market. We've got, this is the urgency. The scientists have come up with a number as far as our carbon budget is concerned. If we're going to keep the climate keep the warming below dangerous climate change, and that's 2 degrees of warming. In order to do that, we can put no more than 600 gigatons of new carbon into the atmosphere. Just 600 gigatons. There's 2,800 gigatons of known reserves of coal, natural gas, and oil. So we've got 4 to 5 times as much known reserves available than the atmosphere can tolerate. So there's no reason that there's any more oil exploration. There's no reason for any of it.
Yeah.
They should not be exploring in the Arctic. They should not be exploring in parks. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
The amount of reserves that's already available is already 4 to 5 times as much as the atmosphere can tolerate. But the only way that we're not going to burn it is if it's too expensive. And the only way that it'll be too expensive is if we put a price on carbon pollution. And that was what I wanted to say as a wrap up, is to stress that for people to understand that the price of fossil fuels is ridiculously low. It should be much, much higher.
As far as change for solar, when the price of hydro goes up too high and the price of solar comes down to match, then people will start switching. And we won't need to make massive projects that take up thousands of kilometers of, I'll say, native hunting grounds and fishing grounds and everything else. And we can all supply and all have our own micro generating plants, and we don't have to rely on whether the price is gonna go up or down for hydro, or who we're gonna sell it to, or anything like that, because we're gonna be using it, we're the end users. That's about it.
Thanks.